So, do you have a favorite car, or a favorite race car, or a favorite airplane? The answer to those three questions for me is yes, yes, and yes. And when it comes to airplanes, I can break it down even further. I have a favorite airplane from the First World War. I have a favorite plane from the Second World War. I have a favorite early age jets, and then more modern jets. I probably even have a favorite airliner. But this is the story of how I came to acquire 7 kits of my favorite World War I airplane, the British SE5A, which originally started as the SE5, although only several dozen of that variant were made before it was replaced with the improved version in 1917. I think the reason I liked the SE5A was I had a fascination, like a lot of kids, with military airplanes. And as I started reading about the First World War and looking at all the various planes, the SE5A struck me as being pretty cool. It was fast. A large number of the leading British aces flew the plane at one time or another. It had sort of a unique look with the pilot set back quite a ways, a Vickers machine gun firing through the propeller synchronized, and a Lewis machine gun on the top wing. I thought it was really cool, and of course it was a successful fighter plane, perhaps not as well known as the Sopwith Camel, but a great plane nevertheless. Okay, jump ahead. I think as a kid, I never had a SE5A kit. I had a number of Aurora kits in the 60s, but the little drugstore where I bought my kits never had an SE5 in stock. And so I went decades and decades without ever building my favorite World War I airplane, or decades and decades not building any models at all. Anyway, that all changed last summer, and I started on a project to build most, if not all, of the Aurora fighters that had been produced by that company during the late 50s and early 60s. Pretty straightforward kits as I remembered. I had about 5 or 6 of them as a kid. I was going to acquire these, see if I could build them up fairly quickly, paint them nicely, do some aftermarket stuff with decals and perhaps pilots, and assemble a collection. And that was the start of how I ended up with 7 SE5A kits. Although technically Aurora called theirs just the SE5 Scout, there wouldn't be any visible difference with the plane. The main difference between the SE5 and the SE5A was the engine, but externally it wouldn't really have been visible. And the Aurora model wasn't exactly overwhelmingly faithful to scale. Now, this was the second of the 14 Aurora planes that I built from August of last year till December, right after I had done a Fokker D8. And I'll show that plane in a minute, well, in a couple of minutes. It's been featured before. But I had this kit, but as you can see from the stack, I didn't stop there. Part of my strategy with the builds was I knew that the Aurora kits were pretty light in terms of what they'd have in terms of painting options or decals. And I didn't think that the decals in a 60-year-old kit would stand the test of time. So I thought it might be a good idea to acquire at least one each of more modern kits. With the SE5A, obviously I went overboard. So I picked up a Revell kit. I believe this kit started from the Aurora molds, which were purchased by Monogram and then ended up with Revell Germany. I might be wrong about that. After Revell and Monogram got together. And we'll talk a little bit about that model too. So I picked up that kit. I actually did use the decals in that kit for my Aurora build, because that's the livery of Mick Manick, the second or third leading British ace of World War I. Well, you know, thank goodness for the internet and eBay. And here is a Rodin kit that I probably got about the same time as I purchased the Revell kit. All the plastic pieces are still inside that box. It's a bit more sophisticated than the Aurora kit, and even the Revell kit probably got close to 90 pieces, but no photo etched parts as I remember, and markings for a couple of different versions. Pretty good kit. I might even build it someday. But by this point, I knew that the top of the line World War I planes, at least in 1/48 scale, were made by the Edward Company out of the Czech Republic. And the first one I picked up was the weekend edition of the SE5A. This is pretty much a pretty sophisticated, really well molded kit with probably, again, about 90 pieces. It's called the weekend kit because it doesn't have a lot of liveries. It doesn't have the photo etched parts. So the idea is if one is dedicated, you can build it over a weekend. I don't think I could have, at least not at the time I picked up the kit. So this one I picked up. And yes, that kit is still inside the box, unassembled. Now I was getting serious. I knew by this point that if you want to really get the finest of the Edward kits, you get what are called their Profi Pack. And so I bought this version. And Edward had several releases, but this is the one I picked up. So this has about 130 or 140 parts with multiple liveries, masking cutout, photo etched parts. Extraordinary kit. I built this one, and I'll show that in a moment. Well, you know, I have to admit, I sort of lost track as I was acquiring all these kits. And lo and behold, I found within the space of about a week and a half that I'd ordered 2 of the Profi Pack SE5a's. Would I send one back? Are you kidding? You can't have enough SE5a's, and besides, I might need the extra parts if I really screwed up. Okay, I finished all the Aurora models, and now it was time to start Edwards, and then I was on the hunt for even more, and that brings us to the last of them. And this one's a little different. It's a Night Fighter variant. So basically, it's the same kit, although with a different engine, propeller, and liveries. This one isn't built either, but it's going to be. So there are the 7 boxes, all balancing on a small Aurora box on the bottom. Whoops. Well, let's see if we can get those out or pushed back. There we go, out of the way. Okay. Lots of plastic sprues, lots of pieces, lots of boxes, lots of pretty box art. What did I do with all of that? Well, I did build the Aurora plane probably around September. 31 pieces. Probably took me about a week and a half, of which almost all that time was waiting for paint to set because it did not take long to assemble it. I didn't try any rigging with the Aurora models. It's not a bad kit. They were designed for 8 to 10-year-olds to build. Very sturdy, very robust, a bit overscale, but you can make a decent model out of them. And again, these are not the Aurora decals. These are the decals and markings that came from the Revell kit. Here it is. It doesn't have any ribbing in terms of outlines on the underside of the wings, which is probably its biggest flaw, besides being massively oversized in the back part of the plane. Something I didn't really realize until I picked up the Roden and Edward kits. I did mention the Revell kit, and that actually is just sort of a test bed. You can see, I could see the heritage from the Aurora kit. They'd done a bit more. Some things were virtually identical. They had put ribs on the underside of the wings. They'd made the spars for the wings and fuselage more robust and easier to put on, if anything. I decided during the course of all this building I wasn't going to complete this, but it would be a useful test bed. And actually, it sort of came in handy a couple of weeks ago when I attempted biplane rigging for the first time in 45 years or so. And that seemed to work out fine. I didn't completely rig it since I'll be experimenting with this for a variety of other purposes, paint types, colors, etc. So this plane will never be finished. Decent model, quite similar, even though it came out, maybe was released a decade or a decade and a half after the last Aurora model, but that's its lineage. Okay, finally, yes, I did get an Edward kit done. This was the first of the Profi Pack SE5a's that I built. It's got more photo etch parts than I can remember. It has a few from both kits, since a few of them went flying during assembly and were eaten by the carpet monster. I did manage to rig the plane using Easy Line, and I was pretty happy with the results, so that's good. And the detailing is really exquisite. It's really hard to show that even when you hold a couple of planes side by side, but it's got much more subtle detailing of everything from the Lewis machine gun to the exhausts. That is an aftermarket pilot. Edward doesn't put pilots in too many of its kits, but with some work you can get a resin pilot in there and squeezed in. That, of course, has one disadvantage because it obscures some of the amazing cockpit detailing, none of which I think is really visible unless I were to take a flash picture, and then that would stop the video. But here it is with its 36 lines of rigging. I know that because that meant 72 contact points. And that took the better part of a week, knowing that I shouldn't push my luck and try and do too much in any one day. Well, having climbed Mount Everest, at least for 1/48th biplanes, I am going to build those other Edward kits. Certainly the Night Fighter, and it's going to be that livery, which I think is really cool. The other Profi Pack original one, I've actually pirated a bunch of parts from it, so that'll probably stay in the box. It's got some great decals. The weekend edition may end up being regifted to somebody. I think I might build the Roden plane. That's in there. It's a little bit different. Looks very much in terms of size and construct like the Eduard kit that came out a decade or two later. And the Revell kit we've already talked about. Here it is. So that's the story of the SE5A plastic models and me. Take care.